starting with salary.
Okay.
You could leave aside any individuals. Tessa, I thought, made a very important point. Particularly, it's often been said, but it's really interesting to hear it come from her, that it's sort of public sector rights and privileges with private sector pay. In other words, private sector, you get all the benefits but not all the risks. Now, the fact that that's been allowed to happen would suggest that your statement, your view that the BBC, the broad accountability of the BBC is pretty hard to beat, would seem to indicate a long-term strategic failure. This is not about how you deal with Ross Brand. It's not about how you deal with this issue or that issue. Long-term, something's gone wrong here.
I think something went wrong. Well, we can go back to particular individuals and the history of the BBC. But clearly, when Greg Dyke arrived, he felt that there was something that needed to be done to try and reassert the people's sense of morale and the worth of what they were doing. He chose the way to do it as money. I don't think, and yet you could certainly argue that the government at the time let it through, and they ought to have said thus far and no further. But and in that sense, you could say yes, there was a failure of accountability. I don't think.
But it doesn't go. I mean, there are nuts and bolts. There are reasons. I mean, we could talk about nuts and bolts precisely how it happened. John Birt also bears some responsibility here.
Absolutely.
Had brought people in from outside, with private sector salaries from ITV and beyond broadcast.
At a time when those private sector salaries were high.
Well, indeed, relatively, and also, and BBC's own internal process of seeing the levelling up. It's the nuts and bolts of it. I'm not so concerned with. But strategically. It was allowed to happen, but doesn't it represent a kind of failure of vision of, if BBC faces a sort of crisis, a real threat to its existence now, it's because of the vision bits?
I think this is 2020 hindsight. I really do. I mean, at the time in which those salary hikes were made, advertising revenue was booming, the world looked a very rich place, and you actually had to attract good people in, you had to pay those sorts of salaries. And I think it's very easy to look back and say, well, actually, they should have looked further ahead to a time when there was worldwide recession and it was going to be tough for people who were in the public sector. I don't think, even strategically, you can say the mechanisms were wrong. I think what you can say is we've now reached a different place, and the trust and the executive ought to be thinking in terms of we're in a different place. We haven't reacted to that fast enough.
What is your view of contestability, of the idea that, broadly, that in some form or other, the licence fee or some part of it should be, as Tessa said, post-digital switchover available for public broadcasting purposes beyond the BBC, maybe administered by the trust, maybe administered by someone else, but it's a very 3 point whatever billion it is, it's a very large chunk. Post-digital, so. Are you frightened by that prospect?
I'm not frightened by that at all. I think it's an appalling prospect. I think it would actually destroy the BBC. It's not a question of being. It's a question of actually trying to understand where that. You're talking about vision. Where would that take us in 10 years' time? The answer is there would be a salami slice.
Well, it could take you to, for example, non-BBC sources of news and information in the nations of the UK.
Yeah, and
democratic is vital.
Competing against
absolutely.
BBC services.
Absolutely. There wouldn't be BBC service, would there?
And what happens when there is something broadcast that offends
because you'd be chairman of the Public Broadcasting Council, and you'd be handing it out to Geraint or Blair or whatever to run their services in Scotland or Wales or Ireland. You'd be holding them to account, but the money to do it with would know to come from the licence.
And something comes up which is either deeply offensive or
they're regulated by Ofcom.
It doesn't matter. The point is, there is then a public campaign which says, this is your money, this is your licence fee money that is paid for this diabolical libel or this appalling lapse of taste.
We get that at the BBC.
But at least you have an institution that is accountable and has accountability.
I think it's forgive me. I mean, I think it's a complete bit of a diversion. They would be accountable. They would be accountable as Channel 4 is or ITV is to Ofcom for what they do. The question is how it's funded.
As soon as you start.
Why is it a threat to the BBC? For a certain amount, a few £100 million a year, maybe £500 million, who knows, to be available for public broadcasting beyond the BBC, for public broadcasting purposes. Why is that a threat?
There is a very simple answer to that question, which is that every single other country in the world in which this has happened has ended up with 5% becoming 8%, becoming 12%, becoming 20%, becoming 40%. It is absolutely inevitable.
Where are you thinking of where this is happening?
New Zealand, Ireland, Canada, you can name it.
Okay, so there's a lady there who's desperate.
No,
You
because
just-
I'm talking about this later, but just in the Irish model.
Let me just
Tell us about
let me just finish this point. The point is that at that point, you lose any political control because the politicians can then decide, okay, it was 3.5% this time. We didn't actually like what the BBC was doing this year. We're going to make it 5% next year. And it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do because the principle has already been breached. Next year's 5% becomes the following year's 8%. You are immediately at the behest of your politicians.
And the principle is not breached by the digital switchover service.
Well, I argued against that at the time, and I was very pleased to say I was proved right. I think that was wrong for the reasons that we now see. But let's put a stop to that. By all means, spend that money on broadband or that because that's an infrastructural project. I think that's actually a very wise thing.
Okay, there'll be more time. Just tell us about Ireland. If
Just
you
very
mind.
briefly,
Just hold on a
because-
second. Hang on. We'll watch over to deal with it. Just tell us about
Just very
Ireland.
briefly, because we'll talk about it later, but just in terms of Ireland's been running a
Sorry, tell
content.
people who you are.
I'm Helen Shaw, and I used to work with the BBC and with RTÉ, so I have a very strong public broadcasting background and support. But the fund has been running since 2003,
Sorry, I think
implemented.
people should know. So there is a fund in Ireland
It's
run
a
by the Broadcasting
content
Commission of
fund
Ireland.
which is run, which was taking 5% of the TV licence fee, which RTÉ, the public broadcaster, would have been getting. And it has been legally frameworked that it's a content public service media fund which any broadcaster who's licensed in Ireland can use. So it's been run and it's just been renewed and it's structured under new legislation since 2009. It has not destroyed RTÉ. In fact, RTÉ has benefited from it. And in some ways, it's actually strengthened content right across the country. So, you know, I would really sort of say that from our experience in Ireland, that has not been the case. That the content fund and taking that amount, it's grown to 7% for sure under the legislation last year. But the review has actually been a public consultation, and also it's reflected what the broadcasters are saying, including RTÉ. So there is no evidence from what we're seeing that it's actually hurt the institution itself.
We're going to come to this in some detail this afternoon, so plenty of time. Mark, let's move on. Mark Oliver. So the BBC faces the fight of its life, and it's got its, well, if you can take it any way you wish, but if you had been conducting the BBC strategy review, what would you have focused on as the key things that need to be resolved?
It's a very big question, and of course I wasn't conducting strategy review. Can I approach this slightly differently? So I have conducted strategy reviews before, and in fact, just being my experience, clearly my colleagues have been studying the BBC a lot, but as you know, I worked at the BBC, I was one of the people that John brought in from the private sector. That's how you know the salary from the commercial rate. I never had a BBC's pension, by the way, because it was banned in those days. It then came back in the Ryanette, so that's great. But I believed I was doing something as a public service. And public value, I'll come back to that.
So that's not a sort of DBC's long-term antagonist?
No, decision made. I've gone on to do other bigger and better things and my money in different ways.
That portion of us all being paid at a discount at commercial rate exists.
So,
So, Mark, just explain before you do now. You run a company.
yeah, I run an advisory company which advises, yes, BBC sometimes, commercial operators, private equity in the media sector.
Leading.
So I've got all these perspectives. Also, I'm one of the only people who sat between the BBC on one hand side and people from the National Audit Office on the other side, so I can share some of those experiences, which are educational. But also, having gone through the strategy process under John Burke, which is kind of the first BBC kind of strategy process, a long-term reaction to the Peacock Committee and Suffolk, because the BBC had 9 years to react to the Peacock Committee and Suffolk. I just wanted to talk a bit